I've been historically a little bit critical of the Ethereum roadmap, not so much for not focusing on scalability, but when they introduced 4844, which is the new blob model, which made it much cheaper for rollups, I actually think they made it too cheap for rollups. I think what you're starting to see with Ethereum is the focus on how do we have the software be both sustainable and also a viable business.
All right, here we are with AJ Warner, the co-founder of Arbitrum, the biggest Ethereum Layer 2 by TVL. AJ, so great to be here with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So Arbitrum has been at the spotlight recently in crypto and DeFi with the big announcement that Robinhood is building its own Ethereum Layer 2 with the Arbitrum tech stack. Can you talk a bit more about what the announcement was? And a follow-up question, and importantly, why do you think Robinhood chose to build with Arbitrum?
Yeah, the two questions are somewhat related, and I'll maybe answer them as one, and we'll see. So the announcement that was made at the Robinhood Crypto Summit, during EthCC, was really about the future vision for Robinhood and their expansion for their user base. It was an incredible example of where you have crypto rails actually powering a traditional business and a strategy for expansion. So specifically and tangibly, the first step, even before we get into the chain, is Robinhood announced, and it went live on the day of the announcement, that tokenized stock trading, stock tokens would be available throughout the entire EU and EEA for customers to sign up. Historically, they only had stock trading available in 6 different countries in Europe, and that expanded to the entirety of the EU. And that was an incredible achievement, and it's their strategy for growth. And the tokenized version of these assets is their way of bringing more users to the Robinhood platform, and not specifically focused at trying to get crypto native people to use to buy stock tokens, but rather there's how do they get more people to trade stock tokens. And they did a great side-by-side demo of where the Robinhood EU app versus the Robinhood US app, and it's basically the exact same user experience, just on the back end, the infrastructure, one is like a traditional brokerage, and the other one is all trading on top of a blockchain. And that product went live on Arbitrum 1, which is the public L2 that everybody sort of knows and loves about Arbitrum. As they continue to expand their vision and their plan for how crypto rails can integrate into the Robinhood product, they also announced that we're going to be working together to launch the Robinhood chain. The reason for that is because they want to build an immersive experience with crypto rails, and we can design the system, the blockchain that they want to build, to match what their needs and requirements are going to be. And I think that's a good segue into the why Arbitrum. And the thing I like to say, I think a lot of people have misconception of Arbitrum. If you talk to some early stage DeFi teams that have been building with us for a long time, they think of Arbitrum as a blockchain. And if you talk to some of the Orbit chains, which is the stack you can deploy, they think about Arbitrum as like an SDK to launch a chain. In the reality, Arbitrum is a platform. And that platform has a top 5 blockchain by economic activity and a very flexible structure for you to be able to launch your own chains. And we want to manage the entirety of the developer experience for how they can leverage Arbitrum for the sake of their business. And Robinhood is a really good example. They wanted to get this product live today. They wanted to integrate within the EVM, the Ethereum ecosystem, and Arbitrum 1's a very easy, quick deploy. All of the infrastructure that they need is there in order for their business to operate. And we have the ability to help them without having to change tech stacks, without having them to work with a different team to bring this to market. We have the ability to scan to expand with them in what they're trying to accomplish. And that's the thesis that we have. The thesis we have is that the world does not need more blockchains. The world needs more opinionated block space. And we want opinionated block space. We want this Arbitrum Orbit stack to be able to be flexible enough for the needs of different verticals. And if you don't need a chain, we want to make sure we have a product like Arbitrum 1, which is robust, liquid, scalable enough to service your needs. So I think that's the core vision and thesis. one thing that Johan, their head of crypto, had mentioned as well is they really liked stylus as well. So for those that might be unfamiliar, Arbitrum is an EVM compatible blockchain, like many other obviously Ethereum-based networks. The thing about Arbitrum is that different is it's not only EVM compatible. So stylus allows you to write contracts on the same blockchain, not like two different Arbitrum chains. On the same Arbitrum chain, you can write your contracts in the EVM, but also Rust, C, and C++, and other languages as well. We continue to add languages. Under the hood, there's like a very complex, multi-virtual machine structure. And we view the EVM as a critical moat for blockchains, but it's the floor, not the ceiling. And as they want to think about how they can bring privacy on chain, how they can do a lot of different things, maybe more powerful computation, the flexibility to say we also want to potentially use other programming languages is something that uniquely is allowed by Arbitrum if you want that and the EVM. So I think that kind of answered the question, but I think it's really about the flexibility of the platform and the vision we have for how we want to design for our developers.
The PR Genius is a top crypto PR and growth marketing agency, helping brands globally with expert PR and strategic growth marketing. They've worked with 300 plus projects like Movement Labs and IO.net. Unlike traditional agencies, they charge only on performance. Their services include earned PR opportunities and marketing services to help boost wallet holders and organic X followers. Learn more at www.theprgenius.com.
Leading up to EthCC, we spoke to Steven Goldfeder, co-founder and CEO of Offchain Labs. Here's what he had to say about Arbitrum's recent successes, as well as their next big moves.
All right, here we are with Steven Goldfeder, the co-founder and CEO of Offchain Labs, the maker of Arbitrum, the biggest Ethereum Layer 2. Steven, it's great to have you in the Defiant podcast. Welcome.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Okay, so before we get to Offchain Labs and Ethereum scaling and all that, I'd love kind of the backstory on how you got started in crypto and what led you to start Offchain Labs.
Okay, sure. So I got started in crypto in around 2013. That was the year I started my PhD at Princeton in computer science. And I was very interested in cryptography at the time. I had done some undergraduate work and like summer research internships in cryptography, and that's what I wanted to do. I didn't actually know anything about cryptocurrencies yet. Actually, the first time I ever heard of Bitcoin was on my visit days to Princeton. This professor, who fast forward is now my co-founder, Ed Felton, gave a faculty lightning talk, a 5-minute talk on Bitcoin. Actually, the talk was how to take down the Bitcoin network if a government wanted to do that at the time. I think at the time, the estimation was a few $100 million to destroy Bitcoin. Obviously, today, that's quite small compared to just the market cap of Bitcoin. So a lot of things have changed since then. And then that night at Princeton, during the visit days, the undergraduates or the admitted graduate students played a poker game, and I think the university or the security group gave everyone a half Bitcoin to wager to enter. So it was very different times. Bitcoin was trading, I don't remember, probably sub $20 at the time. So that was my first time I ever heard of Bitcoin. Fast forward to 2013 when I joined. I was doing research in cryptography, and I became very interested in really problems at the adjacent at the intersection, I should say, between what I used to call cryptography and cryptocurrencies. And that manifested in a lot of work on the secure custody of digital assets. And actually, a bunch of my graduate work was on these MPC protocols to securely custody your assets without a single point of failure. So you can take your keys, cryptographically split them among different devices. And that was something which there was nobody really looking to that at the time in the context of cryptocurrencies. So we had to dust off some more general purpose and older literature and try to build protocols that would work there. It was interestingly early on, it was like an uphill battle to try to get exchanges and custodians interested in these protocols. Although today, fast forward, those have become really the default way, certainly for institutions and large holders to store their Bitcoin, but also other digital assets. And the technology that we developed has been commercialized by many startups and like exchanges, probably most prominently Fireblocks was one of the first ones to bring it to market. During my time in Princeton, I got involved in many other projects really at the intersection of cryptography and cryptocurrencies. Together with my advisor, Arvind, Ed, and a few others, we wrote a computer science textbook on Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. It's printed about a decade ago today, but it's still, I think, the only computer science textbook. So,
Oh, really?
I think so. It's used in hundreds of university courses today in different languages. And then, various other work, but related to what I do today, I would say that in about Arbitrum has its roots, in Princeton, but actually Arbitrum's roots predate me. So at around 2013, Ed had this idea of Arbitrum, and actually, if you go, and he had this idea of like, hey, there are these things called smart contracts. There are these papers. They seem really powerful, but it looks like they have some scaling limitations. And there were actually some academic papers at the time, and I stress academic papers because there actually were no smart contract systems.
Yeah, like 2013, that's like pre-Ethereum.
Yes, Ethereum obviously went live in Mainnet in 2015, and the ideas were around the Ethereum papers. Obviously, preceded Ethereum actually going live. This was very early on when people were really getting excited about the ideas of smart contracts, the possibilities, and then Ed and some others, realized the early limitations. And actually, it started off where Ed led this idea in a class project at Princeton, and this was in the fall of 2014. So again, before Ethereum, that kind of was an undergraduate project. I actually was in that seminar doing my other stuff on securing digital wallets. But then nothing really came of it for some time. Ed went off to the White House. So Ed was the deputy CTO of the United States and senior advisor in the last 2 years of the Obama administration. And then he went off to the White House, and the project kind of just stalled and lied fallow for a while. In the interim, in the following 2 years, cryptocurrencies, Ethereum took off. There were smart contracts. Now we started to see some of the early scaling issues around these as well. In particular, there were things like CryptoKitties, which were testing the early capacity of the blockchain, and it seemed like it was the right time to actually go ahead and build something, in a more, build the system still in an academic context, but actually build out the system. So that's when Harry and I went to Ed's door at Princeton. We knocked on his door in 2017 when he came back and said, hey, that Arbitrum idea from a couple of years ago, we think we should actually, dust that one off and actually build it in a real graduate research, still like an academic project, but really build it out completely. So we spent about 2 years building it in the academic context, and then we published a paper in the summer of 2018, a Usenix security paper, so it was an academic security conference. That summer was also when I graduated Princeton, and also when we formed the startup, when Offchain Labs that was actually founded. It was a very part-time thing for everyone at the time. Ed was still at Princeton, Harry was still at Princeton. I went off to do a postdoc at Cornell, but about a year later was when we raised capital and actually decided, hey, this is something we want to actually, do. So everybody left their other jobs and went full into Offchain Labs. And here we are 7 years later, and a lot's happened since then as well. But that's the origin story, at least.
Super interesting. And so why go with optimistic rollups? And if you can kind of step back a little bit and explain how these Ethereum Layer 2s work and why they're necessary, and then kind of get into why optimistic rollups.
So the things that unites all rollups, and by the way, at the time, there was no term rollup either. This is a term that later came into being, and it actually first came, and we'll talk about ZK rollup and optimistic rollups, I'm sure, but it first came into being in the ZK context. People were talking about, not like for general smart contracts, like taking some ZK maybe payments or transfers and then rolling them up, putting the proofs on Ethereum as a way of like batching and putting more computation off chain. That's where the term rollup initially came from, was from work with Barry Whitehat and others at the EF, I think is the origin of the term. I actually remember it was at the Cornell, so I was a postdoc at Cornell. Cornell had a IC3 at Cornell. Cornell had this boot camp they run every year. And there was an Ithaca that year, and Vitalik was there. This was actually the first time I told Vitalik about Arbitrum. And at that same conference, my friend Nicola Greco, who was at Filecoin Protocol Labs for many years, said, hey, and he was an early believer in what we did, I think you should call what you're doing a rollup. I think you should do that. And I said, I'll think about it. I'm not sure. And then like never really thought about that conversation. But then 6 months later, others started calling, these optimistic rollups, and that's when, really the industry adopted that term. So a bunch of people were dancing around this. But anyway, so what is a rollup, and how do these systems work, and why are they necessary? And the answer is, Ethereum is really decentralized and really prioritizes security. But what Ethereum doesn't do natively on the layer 1 is provide that full scalability. And the reason is, you can see people talk about a trilemma, but just to give you the intuition, there's a trade-off between decentralization and scalability, because decentralization means anyone who wants to can participate in the network, or is a low barrier to entry, right? A network can be, in theory, decentralized, but in practice, if you have to have a data center to participate, it's really centralized, because there aren't very many people in the world that can get access to run a data center. So even though it's in theory, hey, all you need is a data center and you can participate,
it's a high barrier of entry.
It's a very high barrier to entry, which leads to centralization, just because the number of people that can do that is just low. So Ethereum really prioritizes allowing people to solo stake. Well, now obviously now we're post staking, but the idea is solo validate, whatever that means, and participate in the network and run a node and actively validate the network yourself. And what that means is you have to actually have the requirements to participate in the network to be pretty low, and the barrier to entry relatively low. Now, the network only runs as fast as the slowest link in the network. Everyone's fully validating. So the network, you have to set the capacity, and the network runs as fast as the slowest machine that you want to be able to keep up in the network. And so there's this inherent trade-off between scalability on the one hand, because scalability would be, hey, just run faster, require faster machines, but that inherently trades off with decentralization. So there's this natural tension that exists. And the Ethereum approach since about 2020, in October 2020, when Vitalik put out his well-known blog post around the rollup-centric roadmap, was we're going to scale the blockchain in 2 layers. So the layer 1 will provide this, really bedrock foundational security and decentralization. And then on top of this, you will build these layer 2 blockchains that can provide the scalability. So a layer 2 blockchain, or a rollup, is a blockchain that sits on top of a blockchain. In our case, it sits on top of Ethereum, and it inherits the consensus. So the security and decentralization for the consensus it inherits. And on top of that, you have another platform that builds on top of that and is also scales. The second benefit of this architecture actually is that you can have not just one rollup on Ethereum, but you can have hundreds or thousands of rollups and chains building on Ethereum. Today, we have something called Arbitrum Orbit, which gives developers the ability to build their own chains. And there's over 100 teams that are building their own chains today. And they can customize them in any way they want. And that's a really nice thing. So you can have this one core consensus protocol that's providing security for chains that look very different than the core Ethereum. And they can, some of them might add privacy, some of them might add KYC for institutions, some of them might be for certain NFT communities like ApeChain, and all of these basically can live and be secured by the same Ethereum. And also, to give you another example, so we build, besides for Offchain, at Offchain Labs, besides for Arbitrum, we also build Prism, which is the leading consensus client for Ethereum. And one of the instrumental players when many of the big changes in Ethereum's history happened. So if you look to one change, was of course proof of stake. Ethereum moved with the merge from proof of work to proof of stake, and it was a big update for Ethereum. But Arbitrum had to do absolutely nothing to get that update, because Arbitrum sits on top of Ethereum. So Arbitrum's core consensus, i.e. Ethereum, also moved to proof of stake, but Arbitrum didn't have to do anything in order to inherit that. So basically the idea is you can have 100 chains that are building on top of Ethereum, and they all inherit those upgrades directly without having to do anything, as opposed to if you ran each of these separately. So anyway, what is a rollup though? We'll get there. No, here we are. A rollup is basically, so how does it work? So that's what it does. It wants to basically build this layer 2 thing. And the way it does is it takes a lot of the computational work off of Ethereum. And instead of saying, hey, Ethereum, why don't you run this task for me? Why don't you run this computation for me? It flips it a little bit and says, hey, Ethereum, we'll go ahead and run this all off-chain, and we'll tell you what happened. So we're going to run all this computation off-chain. That's how you scale, because we're going to run more computation off-chain. We're going to run, more off-chain than you can possibly verify. We're going to use more resources, whether it's storage or computation, than Ethereum can verify natively, right? You can't run it directly, but we're going to report back the result. Now you might say, well, hang on a second. If Ethereum can't verify it, like what use is this? We want Ethereum security and decentralization to extend to the work done at layer 2, and Ethereum needs to give its stamp of approval. And the answer is it doesn't verify it directly. It doesn't actually run the computation or run the smart contracts of what you're doing. What it does is, though, it verifies them via proofs. So what all rollups do, whether optimistic or ZK, is they take a chunk of, think of it code, run it off chain, right? They take these transactions, they run them off chain. They say, hey, Ethereum, here's the result. And by the way, here's a proof that this result is correct. So now all Ethereum has to do is verify the proof, and thereby it can actually validate and apply its security and apply its decentralization to a much, much, much larger surface area than it can natively validate itself if it was actually running all the steps. The difference, and I won't get into the details now, but happy to go deeper, but just in one sentence, the difference between optimistic rollups and ZK rollups is what that proof looks like. But everything else I said unites them both, and they basically prove to Ethereum something that happened off-chain, and Ethereum has a mechanism by which you can validate the proof and say, hey, even though I didn't run all those transactions, I am convinced and can actually extend my security and give my stamp of approval to this final state that you gave me and said, hey, this is the state of the rollup.
So getting into like CK and optimistic rollups, optimistic rollups were the first ones to come live on Mainnet, but now various CK rollups are also live, and they're gaining steam. And there are people who say that they are kind of the most optimal solution to rollups. What are your thoughts there on kind of optimistic versus CK rollups, and do you see them as a threat to your model, or do they complement, or something else?
I think we've approached this, and I've been consistent over this, over many years. I think the way we've approached this is always looking towards the solution and not towards the tool. If someone comes to your house and you say, hey, I have a leak, you don't want them to come and say, okay, I'm going to fix the leak with this tool. You want them to come first, look at the problem and say, I'm going to fix this, and I'll use whatever tools necessary and whatever I need to fix that. And that's really the way that we've approached this. We're very mission driven. And the mission is to make secure and decentralized smart contracts available and to people without compromise. So people can use this technology, can utilize the benefits of Ethereum and its smart contract ecosystem, but not have to compromise in security or decentralization to do that. And also give people an excellent user experience in the process. And that's really the core goal. And the tool of how to get there was never the point. It was always, let's use the absolute best technology that we can and that we have at the time to do that. The concept of snarks or ZK proofs was certainly not foreign to me. I remember the first time I heard of a snark was back when I was in 2013 in Princeton, when there was this MIT workshop where they were exploring this very new technology. So the snark paper was introduced, the initial paper, in 2012. And actually one of the authors of that paper was my frequent collaborator on the MPC stuff, Rosario Gennaro, who now works at Offchain Labs, also one of the initial inventors of the snark. And the reason I mention this is these ideas weren't foreign, but we actually looked at these and considered these when we were looking at this problem of how do we scale blockchains. And this was always an idea that made sense in theory, but practically my belief back in 2018 and earlier was this technology is fundamentally not ready and not ready to scale blockchains at the scale that we needed and won't be competitive for some time. That doesn't mean that I'm against the technology. That doesn't mean that there can't be a future. And they've said this over the course of many years. It doesn't mean there can't be a future in which Arbitrum, it would make sense for Arbitrum to move over and to use ZK rollups. But looking at that moment, and I believe that that's still true today, optimistic rollups have a significant edge when it comes to a few things. Number one is maturity of the technology. Number one is compatibility of the technology. So being able to fully do all of the Ethereum precompiles and run the same VM without changing hash functions and changing different sort of small details here and there with this, without changing the capacity of different operations. It's always been the most compatible, and also has always been the most cost efficient as well, because people often like to talk about the on-chain costs of verification, which is cheap for for a ZK rollup, but their proving cost is much, much higher. Whereas an optimistic rollup, the proving cost is essentially free because it just comes from running a node. So there's always been, and so my long-held position was and still is that we're not the optimistic rollup company. we're the company that's trying to scale Ethereum and trying to bring a blockchain to people that brings security and compromise and brings security without compromise and brings great UX without compromise. And that's always been the focus. And the tools will be developed, and we're always have been on the forefront of actually developing, the best tools to do that. And we'll continue to iterate. And I'll give you an example, like take ZK out of the picture for a second. When we published the Arbitrum paper, it had something in there called the Arbitrum virtual machine, which was this like really interesting, unique VM design that had really nothing existed like it in the literature. And in the academic context, it was very much appreciated and one of the core contributions of our paper. When we launched Arbitrum Mainnet back in 2021, we launched with this Arbitrum virtual machine. A year later, we retired the Arbitrum virtual machine for the system was called Arbitrum Nitro, and it used a WASM WebAssembly machine, so an off-the-shelf architecture. And you might say, like, hey, how did you do that? Like, you spent years building the AVM, the Arbitrum virtual machine. It was years of research and publication. It was like, so dear to you, and we spent so much time. It was true, but again, I wasn't building a company to commercialize the AVM. I was building a company and trying to solve this core problem of building a better blockchain. And the moment that we thought, hey, we have an even better way to do that, I was super happy to retire the year's work of AVM work that we've done. And the same is true for optimistic versus ZK technology. It's not a choice that we made once, like, hey, in 2018, we committed to optimistic rollups and we need to like die on this hill. It's like, no, we're going to reevaluate and reassess that decision constantly. And the same way, and it's not just ZK, it's everything. If there's an upgrade in the system that we think makes sense, we will advocate for that. On the Arbitrum public chains today, it's not our decision, but we have the ability to advocate, and we have the ability to build software and propose updates of what we think should be the future of the technology. And in terms of where ZK stands today, there have been fantastic breakthroughs in ZK over the course of roughly the past decade that we've been looking at this problem, a little more if you go back to the earliest origins of Arbitrum at Princeton. And I think today we're a lot closer to the point where these two technologies will be competitive and there will be some benefits of using ZK. And we're actually investing heavily internally in this. So we have a research team with Rosario, with Victor Shoup, with Matteo Campanelli, some really excellent ZK researchers, and more broadly on the product and engineering side as well, where we are very, very heavily looking at this problem. I think my preference today is actually a hybrid approach as I think we're heading. I still think that ZK is not going to be able to be competitive with optimistic rollups for the Arbitrum stack in particular, because we have a lot of really good developer features like Arbitrum Stylus, which gives you the ability to write code in Rust and C and C++, and it makes proving much, much harder. I'd rather give developers more tools than have a proving system that's slightly different. But we're very actively looking at this and making deep progress. I think the approach that I'll probably favor long term is more hybrid approach, where you have an optimistic system that can be settled more quickly by a ZK proof. So a system that actually uses both optimistic elements and ZK elements. That's where my current thinking is of where the next phase of what we recommend for Arbitrum to be. But the point is, I'm always about let's build the absolute best technology, and never about the origin or the ego, whether we thought of this first. We are not the optimistic roller company. We're the company that is building the blockchain that scales Ethereum and will be the future of DeFi, of RWAs, tokenization, and giving you the absolute best technology. And by the way, you can see this in the name of our company as well. If you look at all of our competitors, or most of them, they have some form of the word snark or stark or ZK or optimistic like built into the name of their company, because they've taken the bet on this technology, and we're the ZK company, we're the snark company, we're the stark company, we're the optimistic company, right? We're Offchain Labs. Our goal is to take as much as we can off-chain and prove it back to you. And the details of that are really, malleable and can evolve over time. And I do imagine, like I said, there will be a future if we look forward 12 to 18 months where some variant of ZK proofs will be live on the Arbitrum network. And if we look forward 5 years from now, I'm sure there'll be many other iterations as well, because our goal is always going to be to say, how can we do things better? Not how do we continue to push decisions we made 5 years ago. It's always reevaluate.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'd love to get your thoughts on this kind of ongoing narrative that I think has been somewhat resolved recently, but still really interesting on how Ethereum Layer 2s are adding to the Ethereum Layer 1. There was kind of this perception that Ethereum Layer 2s weren't kind of paying their fair share to Ethereum Layer 1, and that so much activity was moving to Layer 2s that that was kind of not benefiting the ETH price. What do you think about that?
I think the thing that actually makes there are two things that make the Ethereum ecosystem different, and what I think are really beneficial features. Number one is the ability to commit to and to see through with the long-term projects. Take a look at the merge, the move from proof of work to proof of stake. That was in the work for 7+ years. It was a committed goal from very, very early on, and something that the Ethereum community saw through. It wasn't always, the most popular. A couple of years in, there were people that had questions: are we ever going to do this? And the answer is yes. We have the ability as an ecosystem to see through and to actually look forward and see through long projects. And the second one is the diversity that exists in the ecosystem. In most other ecosystems, there's a single team, or logically a single team, that makes most of the choices. In the Ethereum ecosystem, there are many different voices and core developers. At Offchain Labs, we have the Prism team, which is very involved in the Layer 1 development. We have the Arbitrum team, which is very involved in Layer 2 development. But there are a lot of other voices that are vying for, to have their input considered of what they believe the future of Ethereum should be. And I actually think that that's incredibly valuable. So there will always be different voices, different opinions that in Ethereum that think, hey, we should be doing this, we're doing wrong this. That's great. I actually think that's a superpower. If there was none of that, it would be a big problem, and it would probably mean because the ecosystem is much more centralized. So there's pros and cons to that, but ultimately, I think that that's a very good thing. But back to the first point, when Vitalik set out this roadmap in October 2020, it was a pretty radical, actually, thing to do, in saying, hey, we view this world in which there will be multiple L2s that settle to L1. There are a lot of benefits to that. But the way I think of this, it's like sometimes you have to take a small setback in order to unlock the maximal potential, right? So there's no question about it that if you can keep everything on one chain and give users that experience and not take not go to the 2-layer architecture, it's going to feel better, at least in the short term, because hey, it all feels the same. We're not changing anything. There's no bridging, and everything's great. But you're going to hit that roadblock where it just doesn't work anymore. And we saw this on some other chains where they had some very high-profile events where the chain basically just stopped working. We literally saw this a few months ago. And Ethereum's at the point where it's taken that big step, and it's now unlocked a much, much better future, a future that will enable it to basically scale well past the demand that we see coming, in the next, many, many years. So Ethereum has laid the foundation to actually scale past that. Now, if you go ahead and open, if you have a highway and you go ahead and open a bunch of new roads, it doesn't, you're doing that because you're perceiving that traffic will increase over time, and hopefully getting ahead of that doesn't mean that on day one, every single one of these lanes will be saturated. And I think that if you look at what Ethereum has done today, it's created the capacity, and now we're seeing so many institutions come on chain, big name institutions, whether financial or others, come on chains and bringing their products and their customers on chain onto Ethereum. And we needed to take, in order for the system to work, we needed to actually take this step and increase this capacity. In terms of are the Layer 2s contributing back to Ethereum or not, a lot of the criticisms that people like to throw out are actually Vitalik laid out in that initial blog post. For example, if you read there, and he said, hey, I think it's good that everyone will have sort of their own little island that they can have more influence over, the idea of L2 tokens, all of this was actually laid out. So it doesn't mean it was right, but a lot of the people like to come and say, hey, you're doing this wrong. No, that's actually the plan. Read the roadmap, and this is actually going and executed pretty much on plan. On the margins, could L2s contribute back more to Ethereum? Absolutely. I think the answer is that we absolutely could. And there are ways that we can think about how do we strengthen the relationships. But I actually think there are ways in which you can strengthen, there are two ways, right? What can Ethereum provide more services and the likes to layer 2s? I think the answer there is yes as well. So I think ultimately we should look for ways to strengthen the relationship. But, we've taken a very, very big leap that will unlock things and unlock the ability for us to scale for years and years to come in ways that other ecosystems will simply not work and not be able to do. And the best thing to do is what Ethereum knows how to do best, is continue to see that along and not give up halfway through. I think we're very, very well along and very well set up and very well established. And I do think there are interesting conversations. Can Ethereum, for example, give enshrinement guarantees to rollups and say, hey, we'll fork in the case of some security incident in a rollup? That's an interesting conversation to happen. Rollups will probably be willing to pay a lot to Ethereum to actually do that. So there are interesting ways in which I think rollups can potentially contribute back more to Ethereum, and Ethereum can continue to actually contribute even more to the security of rollups. And that's a conversation which I'm looking forward to continue to have over time.
What if sending crypto felt more human? Pulse just launched Red Packets, a new way to gift tokens with meaning. It's gasless, gamified, and claimable inside group chats only. Think airdrops meet social cues on-chain. Backed by smart wallet tech and live across major L2s, Red Packets turned communities into microeconomies of gratitude and growth. No seed phrases, no friction, just connection with value. Check it out at pulse.social.
Okay, I think that's super interesting because I've heard a lot about what more Layer 2s can do for Ethereum, but not what Ethereum can do for Layer 2s. I think kind of what Layer 2s can do for Ethereum, it's been said many times, obvious, like it goes down to fees, like just like paying a higher tax in many different ways. But I'd love your thoughts on what you'd expect, what more you'd expect from Ethereum.
Yeah, so this is, it's funny, I haven't really spoken much about this publicly, but I'm happy to do it here today. So I believe that, for example, if you look at some of the core criticisms of the Ethereum ecosystem and rollups today, so what do people not like? They don't like that rollups have security councils. This is one of the core, but what core issues people have? Why do rollups have security councils? Because you need to have security councils in order to in order to be able to respond to, say, an imminent bug, in a layer 2, and that you don't want to go ahead and publish on a DAO forum. So there are very, very good reasons that these things exist today. But I think we can look for ways that Ethereum says, hey, in a very objective way, if a rollup gets to a point where it's a certain level of success, that in the case of a critical bug in a rollup, maybe Ethereum would respond to that in the same way that Ethereum would respond to a bug in its own contracts, right? So have some sort of fork for that, very targeted fork for a a bug, the same way that if we found the bug, in core EVM, that Ethereum would do that for layer 1. That's something that I think would be a big unlock for rollups and actually enable rollups to now get rid of some of these security mechanisms that are trying to do the same thing. If Ethereum could take on that responsibility for itself, and I think asking L2s to pay significant value for that would also be very reasonable. So I'm not against the idea. I'm actually pro the idea that L2s can contribute and should contribute more to Ethereum, but I also think there are ways to two-way street to strengthen this relationship that can actually be very promising and kind of solve a lot of things at the same time, right? So solve some problems that people perceive with Ethereum, but also some of the L2s, right? If we can get to more stage 2 Ethereum rollups that don't have any sort of backup security mechanisms, is actually going to be, I think, a big unlock. And by working together, I think there are ways in which we can unlock these things as both L1 and an L2 working together.
So right now I understand there are no stage 2 layer 2s?
There are no prominent stage 2 layer 2s. There are some that don't have, the problem with stage 2 is, so take Arbitrum, for example. What is, if Arbitrum got rid of, if Arbitrum decided to get rid of its security council, it would be stage 2. Today, I don't think that that's actually the correct or responsible decision. I think it's actually better to have it there for various reasons. But the idea is, being stage 2 itself doesn't mean that it's the right decision or the responsible decision. So there are definitely it's kind of a hard thing to measure. And there are some smaller chains that have made the decision, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, that are stage 2, but no chain with significant adoption is a stage 2 rollup today.
Okay, that's interesting. So yeah, maybe Ethereum providing those assurances would make it easier for layer 2s to become more decentralized.
I think so. And there are a lot of big questions that are hard questions here. It's like, what does it mean for Ethereum to provide that assurance? Who is Ethereum, right? There are a lot of like hard questions here, but I think there's an interesting conversation to be had with the community.
What about what you mentioned about enshrining layer 2s? What would that look like?
Well, that's exactly what this is, right? The idea that Ethereum would take on some responsibilities for the layer 2s directly.
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay, then moving on to the topic of like chain architecture choices, which this was a big bet for Ethereum to choose this layer 2 scaling roadmap, because we've seen other chains take obviously different choices, and so it seems like from what you said earlier, the like monolithic chain architecture like Solana. What you said before is there are trade-offs with scaling the layer 1, where you need to be less decentralized because you need nodes to have you need a higher barrier of entry for nodes. But what about we recently had Emin from Avalanche on the podcast, and so he laid out this different scaling vision, which is on kind of multiple layer 1s or like sub layer 1s, and I think Polkadot tried a similar thing, and so did Cosmos. What do you think about that kind of architecture? And I think kind of Ethereum was going down this path similarly with shards, or it looked more like the Avalanche and Polkadot system. Yeah, what do you think about that architecture versus layer 2s?
I think the example that I mentioned before about the merge and the inheritance of chains is actually the best example to show you why I think the layer 2 architecture is so much better. Right, today we have, just looking at the Arbitrum ecosystem, over 100 Orbit chains, building. They have Arbitrum 1 and over 100 others building their own unique customized version of the Arbitrum technology. Sometimes they're building them as layer 3s in Arbitrum, sometimes they're building them as layer 2s on Ethereum. And if you look at the breadth of these different chains, you have, again, chains that are looking to add privacy, chains that are focusing on institutions and looking to add KYC and compliance measures. You have chains that are just built for specific communities. Sometimes they'll enforce royalties when you transfer specific assets. There are lots and lots of different customizations that chains can make. Some chains are running their sequencers. The Arbitrum public chain runs the sequencer at 250 milliseconds. Some Orbit chains are using the technology and running it at 100 milliseconds. So there's all sorts of customizations and changes that you can make, from very basic ones to ones that are really, really very deep in the depth of the technology stack itself, like adding cryptographic privacy. And we have so many different teams working in the ecosystem that are building these things out. Imagine that all these chains existed as separate layer 1s. So now they're each going to have their own consensus mechanism. They're each going to have their own set of validators, and they may try to share some set of validators, but fundamentally, if they're layer 1s, if they're true layer 1s, they each have their own validation, their own consensus mechanism. And imagine we wanted to make a change or update that consensus mechanism. So when Ethereum, for example, went from proof of work to proof of stake, we'd have to go ahead now and coordinate 100 plus different upgrades for every one of these chains. Or imagine that you're trying to forget about updating them. You're trying to bootstrap the security of these chains. Each one of these chains, each 100 of them has to go and find validators and build these relationships, and they have to have the success of their own chain to be able to generate rewards that make this economically secure, that they're actually paying validators enough that it's that they have enough, a reason to actually want to secure and validate this chain. And it basically stifles innovation. You can't, it's not possible. It's very, very difficult to get, all these validator communities in a way that's actually decentralized and secure. What you have is just a lot of centralization. And you also just if you wanted to upgrade, you're on your own. You don't inherit the benefit of the fantastic Ethereum client teams, the diversity of these many different teams that are, building the cutting edge of smart contract and blockchain technology today. You just don't get the benefit of that individually. But if you build from a layer 2, you actually get the benefits of that directly because you can just rely and inherit Ethereum. You don't have to go and try to source your own validators. You have the best validator set in the world, the most diverse and secure validator set in the world that will validate your chain. You don't even have to ask them. You just build it with a set of smart contracts on Ethereum that tap into Ethereum for its consensus. And via the Ethereum smart contract layer, you get to utilize Ethereum's consensus for your consensus as well. And when Ethereum decides to make an update or some sort of upgrade to its security model or its consensus model, you inherit that in your chain without doing anything. It's a much stronger model that enables you to basically have this diversity of experimentation. Because if I'm want to do something out there and build, say, a privacy chain, I probably want to focus my efforts on actually building the thing the difference that I'm trying to do, not also at the same time trying to worry about building this validator set and validator community and getting the consensus secure as well. And you'll end up with what I'll say is chains that don't really have either people just don't do it. You have limited diversity, or you have validator sets that are much less secure than Ethereum's. And just having one that everyone can reuse is much more secure. Now, I just want to be clear. This doesn't mean just because in a layer 2 you can do this, that everyone does this, right? There are layer 2s that that architect themselves in ways that don't necessarily make use of the full Ethereum consensus. That's where Arbitrum 1 really shines, that it is very decentralized and really relies a lot on Ethereum's consensus. But just because you're a layer 2 and say, hey, I'm a layer 2, doesn't mean that you're automatically, but you have the ability. Anyone who wants to use Ethereum's consensus, they can use the Arbitrum Orbit stack and configure it like Arbitrum 1 and have the direct ability to do that. And that's something that you really don't have the ability to do that on a layer 1.
Yeah, I think the ability to use Ethereum security is for sure a benefit of the kind of layer 2 ecosystem versus kind of multiple layer 1s. But I think maybe a trade-off could be UX, or at least so far it has been with the need to bridge from L1 or even from different L2s back and forth. I mean, as a user, it is a real pain to manage all the different gas tokens and make sure you have tokens on each chain and bridging and withdrawing and waiting for those withdrawals. So, how do you see kind of the state of interchain or L2 versus L1 interoperability, and how can we make it better?
So the first thing I'll say is I don't think that's an L2 problem versus an L1 problem per se. I think it's a one chain versus many chains. Meaning if every L2 became an L1, it wouldn't solve the interoperability problem. You just have now all these L1s that you have to figure out how to bridge back and forth, and you'd have the exact same problem. So I think the best version of this argument is, should we have many chains and take on this extra load of interoperability and bridging, or should we really try to focus everyone on the same chain and therefore you don't have this at all? And for that, I tell you, well, what are you giving up? You're giving up this diversity of experimentation. You're giving up so much because you can't have, on a single chain, all these, different VMs and different customizations and different, different configurations that people do. And you're just basically giving up the ability to build diverse blockchains. And what you'll end up with people building their own L1s, and that doesn't solve the problem, because now you have, if you have 10 L1s, you still don't, it's still a fragmented universe. So I think the answer is, whether you're trying to bridge from an L1 to an L1, an L1 to L2, an L1 to L3, it doesn't really matter. You have to build a really good interop technology between them. And I think, a lot of this actually falls in the wallets, in my opinion. There's a lot of deep focus on protocol research, and there's a lot that we can do. And there are some really good EIPs focusing on this, on bridging and actually executing code on other chains. There's a lot that people are working on here. But ultimately, I think the way that's packaged to the user is going to be their make it or break it. Right? We can build whatever deep protocols we want, but those have to actually be packaged to the user in a way that abstracts a lot of the details away. To use an analogy, imagine you're trying to use the internet, but you don't have a web browser. So you have to go ahead and type in these numbers, these addresses that someone gave you. And to take it a step further, imagine that you're going to, YouTube. So you found this, YouTube's address, you typed it in, and then they say to you like, okay, would you like to use YouTube on AWS, or would you like to use YouTube on GCP today? And you're gonna be like, I don't know, I just want to use YouTube. And I think a lot of the problems that we have in our industry is that there's just a lot of low-level details that users have to contend with, and a lot of this is in their faces. And what we need is really just a web browser, if you will, the Web3 version of a web browser that just abstracts a lot of this away for you. So if I want to go ahead and, if I'm on Arbitrum 1 and I have, say, ETH, and I want to go ahead and buy an NFT on Ape Chain, and the gas there is an ape, then yes, I can go ahead and figure out how to bridge, and then I have money stuck there, and then I have to figure out how to bridge it back. Or I think there's a lot that we can do on the UX side that just says, hey, you want to do this, here's the path to do this. And there's a lot of really good teams, and we're actually building, we've announced that we're building some very strong interop tech to help support some of these flows as well. And I think this is where a lot of the low-hanging fruit is. So ultimately, it's a combination between deep protocol research and UX, but UX is always going to be the most critical thing, in my opinion. We'll get better and better protocol research over time to, just like we upgraded Arbitrum 1 to upgrade the UX of these things. But ultimately, I think we need to abstract a lot more details from users to, just their wallets and their software take care of a lot of the bridging for them, and they can just focus on doing the things that they want to do and abstract the details away that they don't. We have a long way to come for this, for sure, but I think most of the building blocks are actually there, and it's just a matter of better packaging up for users in ways that are intuitive and abstract away some of the decisions and points that they may care less about.
Yeah, look forward to kind of, all those pieces coming together.
Yes.
Okay, so you've mentioned that there are many different layer 2s out there. There's a lot of competition, and recently Base, the second biggest Ethereum layer 2 by TVL, has had just like a really even stronger partnership with Coinbase listing DEX tokens Coinbase listing centralized exchange tokens on their Base DEXs and so on. So I wonder, like, for Arbitrum, what are some of the key what's your edge versus all the competition? And with like such a strong onboarding mechanism that Base has with Coinbase, how can you match that to get more users on your network?
Yeah, the strength of Arbitrum actually is almost exactly that, the flip side of that, which is its neutrality, right? So, Base has done a great job at a lot of things, but ultimately, there are a lot of, take stable coins, for example, right? So we don't have, today there is no Arbitrum stablecoin, and, Arbitrum is the only chain that has USDC and USDT, multi-billion-dollar balances both, other than like Ethereum. Like, this is something that doesn't exist on Base. Well, USDC is their stablecoin. So if I'm a stablecoin issuer, like I probably would be, I'd probably be less likely to issue my coin there. Just an example, but the idea is, I think the core difference between the two is we are very good at building core infrastructure and building the infrastructure for projects to really thrive and succeed. And after that, the thing that about us is we don't compete with you, right? Like, it's not like not like the Amazon business where, hey, you can come and sell a product on Amazon, but don't do too well. Because if you're doing too well, we're going to undercut you and we're going to sell the product for cheaper than you and like kill your business, right? This is like a thing that many have reported like over time. And I think that's the core difference of Arbitrum, which is, it doesn't mean it's easy to succeed in a category, right? There's a lot of really good DEXs, a lot of really good protocols like GMX on Arbitrum. There's a lot of really, strong stablecoin players. It doesn't mean that, hey, just launch an Arbitrum and automatically you have to work hard, but that the cards aren't stacked against you, the house isn't stacked against you, we're not competing against you. And it's a neutral platform where we do our best to make everybody that wants to build there succeed. And I think that's the reason why Arbitrum has been the leading place for independent builders to build DeFi that have really good products and really good innovative ideas, and just want a highly liquid market, a highly liquid chain where they can launch those ideas, tap into other protocols, and build those. It's an extremely welcoming and friendly ecosystem. And again, the idea is that the neutrality of the ecosystem, I think, is actually its core strength. So yes, there are advantages if we were also operating a centralized exchange, or also operating a RAS, and also operating a stablecoin, and also operating wrapped assets. Sure, there might be some advantages there, but I think there are plenty of disadvantages because there are plenty of other people that are trying to compete in this space that may not appreciate it if they felt that the ones building the chain were also building all these other products as well. So the thing that in Arbitrum is and the second thing, by the way, which I think is very unique, is Arbitrum is decentralized. And if you look at where the fees go in Arbitrum, this is like the best example. When Arbitrum takes in transaction fees and now takes in fees from Time Boost, which is payment for a slight ordering, a slight time preference when you're submitting your transactions. And where does this money go? It doesn't go to me. It doesn't go to Offchain Labs. It doesn't go to some Arbitrum Foundation wallet. It actually goes directly to the on-chain DAO treasury that's controlled by the token holders. And absolutely no other chain, can say that. So Arbitrum has collected around, I'd say, 30,000 plus ETH, since the DAO's launch. Those ETH sit in the DAO treasury. The community decides how to use those, how to invest those if it wants. If it wants to sell them. Historically, the community does not sell those. But the idea is that there's a lot of real community power and real community growth, and you can see this in both from the technology decisions, but also from the funding decisions and where the funds flow. And this is, extremely, extremely unique when it comes to the Arbitrum ecosystem. So the two things I would say is, one is the neutrality, and two is the really community alignment and community ownership, which really doesn't exist anywhere else.
No, I think those are great points, and especially interesting on kind of the base ecosystem where, I have seen kind of this perception that if you're not kind of part of a project where Coinbase is an investor in or directly building, then you're not kind of part of the kind of chosen crowd. These are reports that I read, but there is at least kind of this perception. So it's good to have like this neutrality.
The thing about it, and this was really the earliest defining characteristic of Arbitrum from its very, very first day of launch, or even actually before its launch, was the fairness and the neutrality. And so I'll tell you the story how it manifested back in 2021. We launched the chain to developers first. This was a playbook that ended up being followed by many, although not everyone, but we sort of were the first ones to do this. We launched the chain to developers in May of 2021. And we said, anyone who's a developer, submit an application. It was like a simple Google form. You don't have to be like a developer we've heard of, but you're developing a product for users. Submit your application, and we'll give you access to this chain actually before it's launched. And if you use an analogy, if you're building an amusement park, and imagine it's like an amusement park where there's a third party that builds the rides. You don't want to let the people building the rides and the customers, the patrons in at the same time. It just doesn't work. You have to let you want there to be rides there when people come. And our thought was we want actually to give to have developers give them some time to build. And July of that year came around, and there were plenty of projects, some high-profile projects that, hey, we're ready to go, open up. And our thought was, we want to really give everyone a chance to be on equal footing. And if you fast forward, so we opened up in August, the last day of August of that year, and there was just a variety of different apps, and anyone who wanted to be there could be there. So if you take DEXs, for example, right around at the same time that Uniswap launched, SushiSwap launched, and a little DEX you may have never heard of from DXDAO called Swapper launched as well. And our thing was always, sure, Uniswap does fantastically well on layer 1, and they're probably going to win on layer 2 too, but it's not going to be because we stack the cards for them. It's because they're a really good team. They know how to execute, and they know how to win on layer 1. They'll probably do the same thing on layer 2. And if you look today, Uniswap is one of the largest contributors of Arbitrum volume, and Arbitrum is, I think, after Ethereum, Uniswap's top chain. So this has played out, but it wasn't because we said, okay, we're going to make you win. It was, no, we're going to create the environment where we're fair to everyone, and everyone who wants to have a chance can have a chance to win. And if you win, it's going to be because you deserve to win and you actually executed well here. And that's always been the principle, which is we want to give everyone a fair chance. We want to work with everyone and help everyone and support everyone that they think they can have a fair shot in the ecosystem, and they know that we're not competing against them. We're not favoring someone else. And that's the core value of Arbitrum, which I think is so important. And I think that's differentiating between Arbitrum and many others.
For sure. Okay, now to start to wrap up, what are some of the major milestones for Arbitrum this year that or in the following months that you're looking forward to?
So previously, we in the past month and a half or so, we launched something called Time Boost, which I mentioned briefly before, and this is the idea that historically, when it came to MEV, there are different opinions. There's basically two different types of players. There are average users that just want their transactions to be processed quickly, and then there are MEV searchers that want to get some time advantage as well. And historically, there have been two approaches. The Arbitrum historically was first come, first serve, said, hey, we just process your first come, first serve transactions. The regular users were happy. The MEV searchers, not so happy because they don't have the ability to buy time advantage. But also the chain kind of lost out because the MEV searchers would try to spend money in all other places, like whether it's, better connections or better servers or hardware to try to get some time advantage. And the chain wasn't collecting that revenue itself. And then on the other hand, there were chains that basically would say, hey, we auction off basically ordering, and whoever pays the highest can have the next transaction slot. And that's great for these MEV searchers. Not so good for your average user that's just playing their game and wants to get their transaction in very quickly. And what we built with Time Boost is actually a middle ground that I think actually makes everyone happy, quite uniquely. And what it does, it says, the average users don't care that their transaction is actually next. What they care about is two things. They don't want to get front run. They don't want someone else to actually see their transaction, try to sandwich them or otherwise exploit their transaction. And they also want their transaction to be processed quickly. So what Time Boost does is it adds this fast lane where there's an auction every minute where someone can buy 250 milliseconds of delay. And everyone else gets a guarantee that their transaction won't be delayed more than 250 milliseconds. And also their transaction will remain fully private, so until it's published. So nobody will be able to front run them and see their transaction before it's published. They send it privately to the sequencer feed. And in doing so, and now the DAO, because that's where the funds go, is also now already collected millions of dollars of revenue just since its launch. So that's going to be a really interesting one to watch how that continues to develop. I think it's really shaking up how we think about MEV and how we think about this dichotomy. But actually, there are ways to sort of make everyone happy if you go a little deeper, and also a really good source of revenue for the DAO. So that's one very technical thing which I'm excited about and watching. Stylus is another one which we're continuing to see really interesting applications. One of them is Renegade Finance, that's building on-chain dark pools, so privacy, trading pools where you have privacy. They use a lot of zero-knowledge proofs, and ironically, by the way, back to the earlier part of the conversation, even though Arbitrum is not as DK rollup, it's the best chain for launching zero knowledge in the application layer because it's the only EVM chain that can also natively run a roster C++ or C library to verify cryptographic code. So it gives you a lot of efficiency there. And we have really good teams building new and unique experiences that are only possible by Stylus. This is whether it's cryptography like Renegade Finance with privacy, or Phoenix is another good example of a team building privacy, or sometimes it's AI inference as well that you can do really, really effectively. So new applications on chain. And then the last thing I'll say is, I'm really looking forward to the explosion of Arbitrum Orbit chains. And we're seeing this all over the place, from really exciting upcoming large chains, like Converge is a good example. This is Athena's and Securitize and Ethereum are building on this new chain called Converge, which is an Arbitrum chain. There's 100+ others as well. There's Ape Chain. There's lots of gaming chains in the Arbitrum ecosystem. And seeing the diversity of what you can do because of this roll-up-centric layer 2 roadmap where you can have all of these diverse, unique experimentations. You can have them all building on the same Arbitrum technology stack, utilizing the same underlying consensus, which is extraordinarily powerful. So both from a technology, but also a continued ecosystem development, I think we'll continue to see more and more institutions, as well as independent developers come on chain and use the same stack, which is, again, fascinating that you can have the most degen crypto communities and the most button-up institutions in the world all uniting around the Arbitrum Orbit stack and being able to customize it in ways that enable them to do exactly what they want to do and what they need to do on the blockchain. And I think we're going to continue to see a lot more of that in the months to come.
Awesome. Very cool. Last question. Interested on your thoughts on just like the broader DeFi growth in the coming months, because from a macro standpoint, this year has really been kind of the year of Bitcoin, and there's a lot of development happening on the Bitcoin DeFi front with Bitcoin Layer 2s and so on. So from kind of the Ethereum perspective, do you see maybe a threat from Bitcoin becoming the real kind of established global reserve currency, and then most kind of value moving there, and maybe DeFi just happening, or Bitcoin becoming the major DeFi hub, replacing Ethereum?
No, I'm not worried about that at all. And actually, maybe this is controversial, but I'm a big fan of Bitcoin. Right. So my very first intro to the blockchain was when there really only was Bitcoin back then. And I'm definitely a very big fan. And the reason why I eventually, decided to spend more of my time in Ethereum is because, I viewed Bitcoin really as a very important asset. But when it came to actually building smart contracts and new decentralized applications, it was clear that we needed a much more expressive system, and Ethereum and Arbitrum was the answer that made the most sense to me. I actually think it's a big validation of the entire Ethereum roadmap that we're seeing, both from L1 and L2, right? The idea of smart contracts and the idea of L2s, that we're seeing all this renewed interest and activity in doing this on Bitcoin. It's because Ethereum has proven, and Arbitrum has proven that this is important, this is necessary, and we're seeing all this now, these attempts to bring this back to Bitcoin. But I also think the question, though, of Bitcoin can be extremely successful, but that can actually, again, I don't view these things as odd. That can actually help the Ethereum ecosystem as well. To give you an example, there's one of these Arbitrum Orbit chains that I mentioned. There's a chain called Corn, and this is a Bitcoin-denominated chain, a Bitcoin-focused chain where they're doing fantastically well and having a lot of Bitcoin activity and Bitcoin DeFi activity, but again, in the Ethereum ecosystem. So there's plenty of potential to bring Bitcoin, the asset, and incorporate that in Ethereum DeFi and Arbitrum DeFi, and we're seeing a lot of that. But ultimately, the reason why I believe, and I believed back then, and I still believe today, that it's so important to have a blockchain like Ethereum is because Bitcoin doesn't support natively the expressibility that you need to actually do these deep verifications to support what you can do in Ethereum. And a lot of the layer 2s building on Bitcoin today have this security gap, if you will, that it's not really natively verified by Bitcoin. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. So I think I'm fantastically happy to see the validation of people bringing and attempting to bring more DeFi and smart contracts to Ethereum, to Bitcoin. But ultimately, I think the expressibility of Ethereum and decentralization of Ethereum over this, entire EVM is something that's really unique to the Ethereum ecosystem. And I think that will continue to live on. But there are certainly ways that Bitcoin and Ethereum can work together, like, for example, integrating more Bitcoin, the asset, into Ethereum DeFi. And I view these as mostly harmonious, but not really in contention very much.
Okay, so Ethereum won't be dethroned in DeFi anytime soon.
I don't think it will ever be dethroned.
Amazing. Cool. Steven, thank you so much. This was so interesting and wonderful. So really appreciate your time, and we'll continue covering all the developments at Arbitrum and Offchain Labs.
Thank you so much.